Let's take a look at how to write code to have your own get tools called. Here's our old get current time function without the time zone argument. Let me show you how to use the AI Suite open source library in order to have your OM call tools. By the way, technically, as you saw from the last video, the OM doesn't call the tool. The OM just requests that you call the tool. But among developers building agentic workflows, many of us will occasionally just say the OM calls the tool, even though it's not technically what happens, but because it's just a shorter way to say it. This syntax here is very similar to the OpenAI syntax for calling its LLMs, except that here I'm using the AI Suite library, which is the open source package that some friends and I had worked on that makes it easy to call multiple LLM providers. So the code syntax, and if this looks like a lot to you, don't worry about it. You see more of this in the code labs. But very briefly, this is very similar to the OpenAI syntax where you say response equals client check completions create, then select the model, which in this case, we'll use the OpenAI model GPT-4o, messages equals messages, assuming you've put into an array here, the messages you want to pass the LM, and it will say tools equals, then a list of the tools you want the LM to have access to. And in this case, there's just one tool, which is get current time. And then don't worry too much about the max turns parameter. This is included because after a tool call returns, the LM might decide to call another tool. And after that tool call returns, the LM might decide to call yet another tool. So max turns is just a ceiling on how many times you want the LM to request one tool after another before you stop to just break out of a possible infinite loop. In practice, you almost never hit this limit unless your code is doing something unusually ambitious. So I wouldn't worry about the max turns parameter. I usually just set to 5, but in practice, doesn't matter that much. And it turns out that with AI Suite, the function get current time is automatically described to the LLM in an appropriate way to enable the LLM to know when to call it. So rather than you needing to manually write a long prompt to tell the LLM what's get current time, this syntax in AI Suite does that automatically. And to make it seem not too mysterious, the way it does that, it actually looks at the doc string associated with get current time with this comments in get current time in order to figure out how to describe this function to the LM. So to illustrate how this works, here's the function again, and here's a snippet of code using AI Suite to call the LM. Behind the scenes, what this will do is create a JSON schema that describes the function in detail. And this over on here on the right is what is actually passed to the LM. And specifically, it will pull the name of the function, which is get current time, and then also a description of the function, which is pulled out from the doc string to tell the LM what this function does, which lets it decide when to call it. There's some APIs which require that you manually construct this JSON schema and then pass this JSON schema to the LM, but the AI Suite package does this automatically for you. To go through a slightly more complex example, if you have this more complex get current time tool that also has an input time zone parameter, then AI Suite will create this more complex JSON schema where, as before, it pulls out the name of the function, which is get current time, pulls out the description from the doc string, and then also identifies what are the parameters and describes them to the LM based on the documentation here shown on the left, so that when it's generating the function arguments to call the tool, it knows that it should be something like America/New York or Pacific/Auckland or some other time zone. And so if you execute this code snippet here on the lower left, it will use the OpenAI GPT-4o model, see if the LM wants the function called, and if so, it'll call the function, get the output from the function, feed that back to the LM, and do that up to a maximum of 5 turns, and then return the response. Note that if the LM requests to call the get current time function, AI Suite or this client, it will call the get current time for you. So you don't need to explicitly do it yourself. All that is done in this single function call that you have to write. Just note that there are some other implementations of LM interfaces where you have to do that step manually. But with this particular package, this is all wrapped into this client chat completions create function call. So you now know how to get an LM to call functions. And I hope that you enjoy playing with this in the labs. And it's actually really amazing when you provide a few functions to them and the LM decides to go and take action in the world, go and get more information. to fulfill your requests. If you haven't played with this before, I think you find this to be really cool. It turns out that of all the tools you can give an LM, there's one that's a bit special, which is a code execution tool. It turns out to be really powerful. If you can tell an LM, you can write code and I will have a tool to execute that code for you, because code can do a lot of things and we give an LM the flexibility to write code and have code executed. That turns out to be an incredibly powerful tool to give to LMs. So code execution is special. Let's go into the next video to talk about the code execution tool for LLMs.